Here is a clear, lecture-ready English summary of the passage, pp. 133 to 135, The Sickness unto Death. Summary in English. Kierkegaard teaches that despair is a universal condition. Just as no human being enjoys perfect physical health, no one is entirely free from despair. Beneath everyone's life lies some inner uneasiness, anxiety, or disturbance. This sickness is not of the body, but a sickness of the spirit, and it often hides itself until moments of unrest reveal its presence. Despair exists even before we become aware of it. Someone who denies being in despair may in fact be in the deepest despair because he has no consciousness of his spirit. In this sense, most security, satisfaction, or worldly contentment is actually despair, since it reflects a life lived without true awareness of the self as spirit. The greatest tragedy is not material suffering, but failing to recognize one's own spiritual nature. A person who is fully absorbed in pleasures, work, or worries may live a life that appears successful, yet remains separated from his true destiny of relating to God. Such a life is wasted, because it never becomes conscious of the eternal. Kierkegaard illustrates this with the metaphor of a house. A human being is like a house with a basement and a first floor. The first floor represents spirit, freedom, and eternity. The basement represents sensory desires and superficial concerns. Most people choose to live in the basement and even defend it as the only real home. They refuse to move upstairs where their true identity as spirit awaits them. For Kierkegaard, this refusal to live as a spiritual self is precisely the essence of despair. Key message: despair is common, not rare. It is the sickness of forgetting one's eternal self. Becoming aware of despair is the first step toward healing and toward God. Here are 3 reflection questions you might use in class. Q1. In my daily life, do I live more in the basement or on the first floor of my being? Q2. How do comfort, success, or busyness sometimes hide the presence of despair? Q3. Why does becoming aware of despair open the way toward true spiritual life? Here is a clear, well-structured English lecture script, manuscript style, based on the pages you shared, pp. 136 to 140. Professional tone, understandable language, designed for spoken delivery to students. You may read it as is. English lecture script, The Dynamics of Despair. Today we will explore Kierkegaard's understanding of despair as a fundamental problem of the human self. First, Kierkegaard states that a human being is essentially spirit. What does this mean? Spirit means to be a self. And what is the self? It is the synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, freedom and necessity. In other words, we are not only physical and temporal creatures. We are also eternal beings created to relate to God. To be a self is to become oneself, and this can only happen in a proper relationship with God, who holds this synthesis together. Despair is completely overcome only when the self, in relating to itself, is grounded openly and dependently on God. When we live without this relationship, we fail to be who we truly are, and failing to be the self God created us to be is what Kierkegaard calls despair. 1. Finitude's despair, the despair of living only for the finite. This first form of despair occurs when a person reduces life only to the physical, the practical, and the earthly. He becomes trapped in the finite. He forgets his true name and his spiritual identity. He finds it easier to live like everyone else, as one more number in the crowd. This kind of person may look successful. Society praises him for his accomplishments. He appears confident and satisfied. Yet spiritually, he has no true self. He is a copy of others. He values only what the world values. His identity is defined externally. In this condition, he becomes a stranger to his own soul. This is a despair that goes unnoticed in everyday life. It is the despair of a person who remains asleep in comfort, unaware that his spirit is wasting away. 2. The despair of weakness, not wanting to be oneself. This type of despair shows itself as passivity. The person does not want to take responsibility for becoming who he truly is. He is controlled by pleasure and pain. He believes his happiness depends on external circumstances. When things go well, he is happy. When things go wrong, he says, "I am in despair," but he does not understand what that means. He wants help only from the outside and waits for conditions to change. He never rises to spiritual responsibility. Ultimately, The person in the despair of weakness wants to be someone else. He misunderstands himself so much that, like Kierkegaard's humorous example of the drunk peasant who cannot recognize his own legs, he no longer knows who he is. 3. The despair of defiance, wanting to be oneself without God. This final form of despair is the opposite of weakness. The person is strong-willed and proud. He wants to create himself entirely by his own power. He rejects any obligation to God, claiming absolute independence. He wants to decide what he shall be, what he shall have, and what he will become. He crowns himself king of his own existence. But, as Kierkegaard says, this absolute ruler is a king without a country. He rules over nothing. When suffering comes, instead of seeking God, he becomes angry and uses the suffering as a reason to hate existence itself. He refuses any comfort or help from God. He would rather endure hell than receive grace. He rebels against the very power that gave him life. This is the despair of defiance, a self who loudly declares, "I will not be changed. I will be my own master," and yet ironically destroys itself in the process. Conclusion. Kierkegaard teaches that despair is not only emotional sadness or depression, it is the spiritual sickness of not becoming the self God intends. We fall into despair when 1. We live only for the world and forget our soul. 2. We refuse to take responsibility for our lives. 3. We try to be our own God. True healing comes when the self rests completely and dependently in God, the one who created us and holds us together. Reflection questions for students. Q1. Do I define myself only by external things? What is my true identity beyond success or comfort? Q2. In what areas of my life do I avoid responsibility and hide behind circumstances? Q3. Where do I see pride or resistance in my heart toward God's guidance? If you'd like, I can also format this into a PPT slide deck, add discussion prompts,